The idea of states having a responsibility to protect their citizens is a good one. The idea of the international community having a responsibility to intervene when states fail in that first responsibility is also something that I think is a good idea. But I don't support the responsibility to protect. I would put myself in the category of being a skeptic with respects to that. But I do support humanitarian intervention. And very often, unfortunately, people who don't wholeheartedly support R2P are kind of condemned as being callous, that they're not interested in human rights. And in certain cases, unfortunately, that seems to be the case. But in my case, the argument that I put forward with respects to R2P is that it really has changed nothing. It's a slogan, and in actual state practice, it doesn't amount to very much. And it has distracted people away from the big issues. And that's really what I'm going to try and talk about today. I mean, one of the things that Jack Straw, the former UK Foreign Minister, said in 2005 when the responsibility to protect was endorsed at the UN was, if this responsibility had been in place 10 years ago, hundreds of thousands of people would have been saved in Rwanda. The idea being, if only we'd had this law, norm, whatever you want to call it back then, we would have been able to do something about it. But of course, anybody who's looked into this in any detail, the Rwandan genocide, it's pretty clear that the barrier to intervention, the barrier to stopping the genocide wasn't international law, it wasn't sovereignty. It was just a lack of will. States were not interested in intervening in Rwanda. Now, what has R2P done to change that? It really has done very, very little, if anything. And the idea that we have something today that we didn't have in 1994 is just simply disingenuous, I think. It's worth, first of all, clarifying what the responsibility to protect is. The first sentence in the report, whose 10-year anniversary we're honouring today, the report is about the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, the question of when, if ever, it is appropriate for states to take coercive and in particular military action against another state for the purpose of protecting people at risk in that other state. Now, increasingly we've moved away from that focus, and I'll come to that in a minute, but what it is today is different to what it was in 2001, and what we've seen with respects to this 10-year evolution of R2P is a gradual move away from the more controversial and arguably more interesting aspects of the original ICISS report. When we speak about R2P today, we have to refer really not to the 2001 report, but to the 2005 agreement and also the 2009 General Assembly discussion on the responsibility to protect. That is really what it is in actual state practice. And what that comprises is this internal responsibility. States must protect their own people from the 4 crimes that James talked about. And if they don't, then the international community has a responsibility to intervene on behalf of the people suffering that. Now, with respects to the first of those two aspects of R2P, that has long been a principle in international relations. Even before 1945, this was relatively well established. But just to look after 1945, there are myriad international treaties on human rights which say you cannot do A, B, C, and D. States have signed up to various different doctrines, treaties, declarations saying we promise not to commit the following crimes against our own people. The notion that something different happened in 2005, that states suddenly said, okay, we accept that we shouldn't do, shouldn't commit genocide, simply untrue, particularly in the case of genocide. That was established in 1948 as being something states simply cannot do. That's been long established. The second aspect, however, the external responsibility, that's really the core of this debate. That's what humanitarian intervention is all about. States, we know, are not going to abide by these laws. So what do we do in those situations like Rwanda and like Darfur? The problem with respect to the second aspect of this R2P is that it's entirely predicated on the assent of the Security Council. And that's really the nuts and bolts of it. It has achieved great rhetorical success. There are God knows how many international centres for R2P. R2P is widely used as a term in political discourse and also within academia. But there's very little content to it, specifically in the context of this external responsibility. Now, coming to this idea of it being entirely predicated on the Security Council, R2P has not changed in any way international law. The Security Council has not accepted any obligation to intervene when a situation reaches a particular nadir. It has what it has always had, which is a discretionary entitlement. It can choose to intervene in a situation. It can choose to say, this is an R2P type situation, and we decide to intervene. The consequence of that, of course, is that it can also choose not to intervene. And it has always had that power. This was precisely the problem that R2P was established to sort out. The problem that we saw time and time again in the 1990s, where we have intervention in certain situations, but non-intervention in other situations. And this inconsistency was a direct result, of course, of the fact that the decision-making at the Security Council puts very little emphasis on human rights. It's about the interests of the P5 at any particular time. Hence, it's perfectly logical that their response to Rwanda in 1994 contrasts sharply to the response to Haiti the very same year, where there is a Chapter 7 mandated course of intervention, but not in Rwanda, bizarrely. Since 1948, we've had the Genocide Convention, which again says if genocide is taking place and the state is unable or unwilling to put an end to that, then the Security Council can take action. The problem with that, of course, is that we've had a number of genocides since 1948. And you ask, well, what? Anyone looking at this will say, well, why? If this is banned in 1948. The problem is precisely the Security Council. The Security Council decides what action to take. Now, R2P has not in any way changed that. Now, people will talk about this idea that it's a norm. But what we would when you're looking at these norms, granted it's entered the political discourse, as James has said, and we all have to refer to these things time and time again, but the norm has always existed. At its most basic, this norm is you cannot treat your citizens any way you like. That's always existed. Secondly, the international community may intervene if it decides to. That's, again, always existed. You might ask the question, if this was something that challenged the behaviour of states, internally and externally, why would states, particularly the great powers, feel so happy to support R2P, as they did in 2005? If you read the General Assembly debate in 2009, two of the most effusive speakers on behalf of the idea of responsibility to protect, in particular, was Sudan. Sudan's submission in the General Assembly in 2009 said, oh, you know, states should do all these wonderful things for their people. This is a long-established social contract theory. And yet you'd have to ask again, why would Sudan sign up to this if it wasn't obvious that this was just a slogan? It doesn't really impose any change in international law to Sudan, nor does it give powers to the international community to intervene in Sudan that previously they didn't have. The currency of the term, then, and the currency of all terms, is not indicative of their efficacy. If it was the case that the more we use a term, the more it means that it has real importance, then we wouldn't have had genocide since 1948. After the Holocaust, never again, never again, never again. But of course, always again. Time and time again, we had genocide. Additionally, we would have made poverty history when all the rock stars got together, whenever it was 4 or 5 years ago. The currency of these terms and the kind of semantic incantation that accompanies them, I think people misplace for having some genuine meaning in international relations. A consequence of this failure to really address the key problem, which is the Security Council, is this attempt to change R2P, to move it away from the first sentence I read out, to move it away from humanitarian intervention and to orientate it more towards prevention and issues like the right to water, climate change, the rights of the child. All of these things are being bracketed as being R2P type situations. And this, to my mind, and to people like Tom Weiss and various others, constitutes an evasion of the key issue, born from the fact that they have failed to effect any significant change in the actual behaviour of states or the international architecture that regulates the behaviour of states. And the result of this then, the result of this failure to change anything substantially, is that the entire effectiveness of R2P is predicated on one thing, which is moral advocacy. The capacity of global civil society, of these various different enlightened, retired politicians, current politicians, special advisors, to change the behaviour of states by virtue of putting forward these arguments that states will feel compelled to address. Now, if we look at that, if that's what R2P ultimately is, and it must be, because it affects no legal change, if we look at the record of moral advocacy, I think we can see the problems that start to emerge here. In 2003, 15th of February 2003, there was a massive international protest against the looming war in Iraq. Far more people came onto the street than ever before and said, we do not want our democracies to go to war in Iraq. And yet, of course, we know they went to war in Iraq. Additionally, from 2003 onwards, there was a massive global civil society campaign mobilised to do something about Darfur. And yet, you know, despite the best efforts of George Clooney and various other different people, nothing really happened. Okay, various different Security Council resolutions obliquely condemning what was happening, but ultimately any action taken on Darfur was predicated on the support and the consent of the Sudanese government. The very government that was, by the UN's own reckoning, bringing a reign of terror to Darfur. So we're asking you, is it okay if we go in and do something about the problem you've caused? Now that should give us some pause for thought with respects to this idea of moral advocacy. And it leads, in some respects, to this idea that possibly what some people are kind of labouring under the misapprehension that they can do something. And this kind of hubristic idealism informs a lot of the R2P kind of supporters. One example, David Sheffer, he writes, "The message of R2P should be championed by school children and their parents, stamped on bumper stickers, and broadcast through enlightened corporate sponsors so the policymakers ultimately comprehend this siren call of their peoples." The idea here again is that, we wave flags and we have bumper stickers talking about R2P and various different things. It's like the wristbands from Make Poverty History. And somehow, by virtue of us all becoming, swelled up with this notion, it's going to influence the behaviour of states. And yet, as I say, the record in that respect doesn't seem to really give us much grounds for hope on that. Just to take an example of this, does Russia really care what middle-class Western people do in terms of putting bumper stickers on their cars saying, let's support R2P? Is there a link between popular agitation in the West and the policies pursued by the Chinese government? When China looks at a situation in international affairs, does it say, what action should we take? What factors will we consider? We must consider, the popular agitation of International Coalition for Responsibility to Protect. I would suggest it's highly unlikely. Even within the United States, William Schultz looked at the number of people active in these types of humanitarian organizations, and he put the number of 50,000, which he said is less than 0.02% of the total population. Again, given that number, is it logical that even in a democracy, we can have that, take the ear of the politician and say, you must do something about Darfur, and they will respond to what is happening? And of course, what people will no doubt say to counter this is, well, how do you explain Libya? Libya seems to be a classic case of R2P, in the words of Gareth Evans, working exactly as it should have been. I would suggest, however, that rather than it being a success, what Libya is an evidence of the shortcomings of the responsibility to protect. I supported the intervention in Libya, but I see it from what I think it is, which is a welcome aberration. It's consistent with the Security Council's record of inconsistency. We've had various different instances in the past where the Security Council has mandated action. Even in the Cold War, over Rhodesia in 1965, over South Africa in 1977, the internal behaviour of states was condemned by the international community, and in the case of Rhodesia, military action was sanctioned. The fact that R2P exists and that there was an intervention in Libya, the two are not necessarily linked. What we've seen here with respects to Libya is the entire operation, as ever, being predicated on the support of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And again, we have to start asking questions, well, why did the Security Council support the intervention? And if we just take the two countries that, again, are generally portrayed as spoilers with respect to humanitarian intervention, Russia and China, their position the evidence seems to suggest, was entirely predicated on the support given by the League of Arab States. Once the League of Arab States said, let's do something about Libya, Russia and China felt, well, we have to abstain because we have interests in those regions and we don't want to annoy that particular organisation. Why then did the League of Arab States support the intervention? I think it's beyond logical to suggest that the League of Arab States, which is comprised of an overwhelming majority of authoritarian states, felt compelled to do something about Libya for humanitarian reasons. At the same time that this was happening in Libya, Saudi Arabia was providing military support to the Bahrain government to put down popular protests in Bahrain. Now, if that's not inconsistent, then, I don't know what is. Clearly, there was something else involved with respects to Libya. Now, that doesn't mean that the Libya intervention has to be condemned because there was some national interest involved. As I say, I support that. But it means we have to be more realistic and say this was not R2P, coming to fruition. This was consistent with the Security Council's record of inconsistency, as we can see today with respects to Syria.